from a very beautiful part of Australia. Okay, well let's kick off, folks. Good morning to you all, wherever you are joining us from. This is our second keynote series address for the Canopy Collective for 2025, and it's lovely to see people joining from around the not only Australia but Australasia, from across the ditch. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're based and their connections to land, sea, and community. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, and other First Nations people joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josie Gibson, and I support the team behind the Canopy Collective, the national network of practitioners, volunteers, collaborators, and partners working in and with communities on their resilience aspirations. So a little bit about what's coming up in the collective program as we head into winter. Next week on the afternoon of Tuesday, April the 15th, we have a fantastic Resilience in Action session with Melanie Bloor, who's co-founder of Resilient UKI in lovely northern New South Wales. And she'll be discussing the role of kindness and connection in building community resilience, which I think is just a fantastic topic for all of us. We were just talking about it as we were getting on the call. When you look at what is happening around the world, we're coming back to these themes of compassion and connection time and time again. And they are big resilience drivers. The research backs that up. On May the 21st, we have another Resilience in Action conversation featuring Zena Armstrong. She's speaking about renewable carbago and other facets of that community's work, helping the district move through the devastating impacts of the Black Summer bushfires. And they are doing some absolutely amazing work, and can't wait to hear from Zena. And in early June, we have another of these keynote series addresses, this time with the CEO of Sustainable Infrastructure Australia, Toby Kent, who's going to be looking at sustainability trends for communities. And some of you may recall that Toby was Australia's first Chief Resilience Officer. So bringing all of those themes together, Toby is right across it, and he's making time to join us, and I think from Brisbane, because he gets around Australia regularly. And for practitioners on the call, there are a number of practitioner check-ins scheduled over the next few weeks, and the Forward program will be out to you very shortly, or just reach out to Marie and Tia if you want to get those dates in the diary. And if you haven't yet checked out the Resilience Canopy's new portal, Canopy House, do yourself a favour. It's a great resource and a terrific way to keep in touch with each other, as well as with potential partners and collaborators. It's now my pleasure to introduce Meghan Burkett, Executive Director of Ethical Fields, a consultancy specialising in community wealth building and place-based capital initiatives for the Australian context. It's common to hear community groups and change makers, talking about the downside, about a lack of resources and especially funding, which is presenting barriers to communities progressing their key projects, particularly in the resilience field. So Meaghan joins us today to explain why and how communities have much more at their disposal than traditional grant and financing options. So thinking a bit more broadly. Meaghan leads the Place-Based Capital Initiative within Ethical Fields, which helps local organisations and communities to identify, access and manage the capital that you all need to achieve your goals. This includes not only financial capital, which is what we usually think about, funding, finance and income, but also capital assets like land, natural resources, infrastructure, enterprises and equipment that communities can generate, own, govern and use for your benefit. So while community ownership per se isn't a new concept globally, what really impresses me about Ethical Fields' approach is their commitment to develop really practical tools and models that work here in this part of the world. Because most of the thinking and frameworks, as with other areas, comes from the US and Europe quite often. So it's really wonderful to see local resources and tools for this part of the world. And the intention is to help communities fund new ways to address pressing local challenges and build a foundation for long-term prosperity, equity, and resilience. So, as well as working directly with communities and leaders on projects, Meaghan and her peers regularly share aspects of their approach through public forums that take people through the fundamentals of place-based capital. And you'll find details of forthcoming sessions on the Ethical Fields website. But I think that there's a fundamentals program coming up on the 4th of June, but Meaghan can fill you in. And another potential play in the works, which might interest people on the call, is a networked local investment fund. And if that pings for any of you, please do reach out to Meaghan to find out how you or your organisation can get involved in the feasibility study. That is really exciting work. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Meaghan, and then we'll take some questions after that. So welcome, Meaghan. Great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Josie, and so nice to be here with you all. I'm just give me a second to my end. How's that presentation there? Yep, all good to go. All right, fabulous. Now, so thank you again for having me here today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the lands across Australia that we're all joining from, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And yeah, thanks so much to the Resilience Canopy for organising this session, and for all of you for coming along. And as Josie so wonderfully framed, today I guess I'm going to speak to you about place-based capital, and try and frame that in its critical role in building stronger and challenge-ready communities like you're all trying to do. And I guess just a little bit about myself and what brought me here personally. Over my career, I've worked in many environmental and social impact areas, climate change, environmental protection, biodiversity conservation, corporate responsibility, community development. And I tried really hard to have a positive impact in these areas. But what I found was that it really didn't matter how hard we worked to progress these agendas, the economic and capital system just kept holding them all back. So these days, I am just like putting a laser focus on the economic and capital system, and really focusing on what communities can do right now and what communities can do within their control. And I do that in lots of different ways, but one of those ways is through the Place-Based Capital Initiative, which exists to advance place-based capital in Australia, of course. It facilitates a network, it gives training, and develops a bunch of tools and resources, like Josie said. And from the sounds of it, it sounds really similar to the Resilience Canopy approach. So yeah, I think our network and yours can probably really support each other, and it'd be good to keep connecting after today. So for today's discussion, I'm going to share some of the key developments and insights and tools from this work that we've been doing, and I really hope it might inspire you in your own. I'm going to kind of go across 4 key points to cover with you. So I'll introduce what we mean by place-based capital. I'll outline the case for focusing on capital and why it's so critical for challenge-ready communities and just communities generally. I'll demonstrate how communities can strengthen and activate their local capital system, and summarise that out with the importance of working together. So to start with this first introduction around what is place-based capital, what am I talking about here? It's good to start just generally with capital. And those of you that might be new to these terms and feel like capital is something that's over there that the financy people do, and that's for them and that's not really for us. And today I just fully want to demystify that, break that apart, and say, capital is absolutely for us. If you live in a community, if you are part of a community, then we need to kind of latch on and make capital our own. So really, this term capital, it can mean lots of different things, but broadly, it's a term that describes a resource or an asset that stores or provides benefits and value to the people or the economy and the broader environment. And you might hear it being talked about in lots of different ways. So natural capital or social capital or cultural capital, human capital. So lots of different types of capital. But the type of capital that we've been really focusing on is financial capital and capital assets. And we've been doing that really intentionally because we find community are inherently very good at building things like social capital and cultural capital. But financial capital and capital assets really need a bit more support and work for us to really actually be able to kind of control them. So throughout today, if I'm talking about financial capital, all I'm talking about is money, really, or things like credit or other forms of funding that you're using all the time for expenditure and investment and production. So if I'm using that term, that's what I'm referring to, and that's where we're focusing our effort on all those different types of money and credit. And the other one is capital assets. So in that way, I'm just talking about property and resources that hold value. So really practically for you, that's things like land, it's natural resources, it's buildings, businesses, facilities, infrastructure, equipment, and then things like intellectual property and data. So all the wonderful assets that exist within your community and across Australia. And the next component in place-based capital is values and principles, because at the heart of every economic and capital system, there are guiding values and principles that shape policies, that shape business, that shape markets, and that flow on to the way that social and environmental outcomes are shaped. And for the past 6 years, we've been hearing a really clear and consistent message from many communities across Australia, and maybe that's your own too. And those communities have been sharing with us was that they want economies and they want a capital to be aligned with these types of values that you can see here. So place, people, local leadership, ownership and governance, inclusion and equity, regeneration, resilience and prosperity. So bringing these components together, place-based capital is a model of capital guided by these values. So it's about capital that's really grounded in a place. It's about capital that serves and empowers the people of that place, you know, local individuals, the families, local businesses, their employees, community organisations, councils, other organisations. It's very much about empowering places and communities to lead and own and govern their local economies and assets, providing local people greater ownership and control over capital, over development, over wider kind of investment activities. Importantly, it's about those more inclusive and equitable opportunities. So really ensuring that all local people can participate in the economic and capital system. And it's about really reinvesting and keeping that wealth and those resources and those opportunities circulating in a community. And then so ultimately, we're really aiming to shift communities from capital dependency, where a lot of us are now, to capital empowerment, to capital self-reliance and resilience. And, you know, we're doing this so communities can meet their needs, so communities can deliver the essential services they need. They can solve their own local challenges and really kind of build that collective prosperity. I guess it's really important to note that while this model starts locally in place, it really is highly scalable, so it can be applied at a regional or a state, even national level. But we do that by ensuring that the capital systems remain connected to real places and to real people. And I guess, like Josie framed, this isn't necessarily a new idea. Examples exist historically and today across Australia and globally. But what we find in this era is that we have to really strengthen and nurture this system of capital and grow it. So why focus on capital? We're all out there, we're focusing on so many things. Why do I think every person in a community should start to put some effort or a big effort on focusing on capital? There's a few really important reasons. The way capital currently operates is at the root of many of the issues we face today. So things like cost of living, stagnant wages, infrastructure and service deficiencies, housing affordability, small business viability. We've got people working really hard to resolve all of these types of issues we see in communities. But I believe, like, the unfortunate reality is that no amount of well-intentioned effort will create the lasting transformation needed unless we really address the underlying capital causes of those issues. Another really good reason is that financial capital is really currently essential for economic transactions and addressing these issues. We need money to buy things, to build things, employ people, run things, maintain things. Maybe that might not be the way of the future, but it's the way of the current reality. And we need all of this money, but most communities really lack financial capital, and many rely on a lot of external sources. The next reason is that capital assets fully underpin our economies and our societies. All those wonderful assets I talked about. We need land to build houses, to grow food. We need natural resources for, mining and production. We need buildings for living and running businesses, and infrastructure for transport and things like that. But really, the power of capital assets extends beyond these immediate uses. And it's really important for us as communities to just fully acknowledge and call out loudly and recognize that whoever owns and controls capital assets in a community ultimately determines the economic outcomes of a place, and also the social and environmental outcomes of a place. So some of the benefits that flow from owning and controlling capital assets in a community, the first is, income generation. Profit, rent, dividends, financial capital comes from capital assets. So we're not going to get financial capital without those capital assets. They provide commercial opportunities, control over how assets are used, things like appreciation over time. You can use them for further investment, leverage them to get finance from banks. And importantly, inclusive ownership over assets is what leads to social equity. So capital really, I guess, I hope I framed here, is so important for building these strong and challenge-ready communities that you're aspiring to. And any transition towards that is really going to require access to and control over capital. So you can kind of, shift to renewable energy, circular economies, climate adaptation, whatever it is that your focus is. And finally, why it's so important is that places and communities really can control and influence their local capital systems. And we're seeing that they actually have way more power than they think. So it's really exciting. So yeah, I guess I'd just say, for communities wanting to build more of that readiness, and to be able to sort of, adapt to, shocks and stresses like you're working towards, we do really need to have this local capital foundation and system that will support you to do this. So to what extent we strengthen and activate this model really depends on the need and demand from communities. And here's one example of some of the people and places across Australia that are seeking or already engaging with place-based capital. And this representation here was based on a very small expression of interest just within our networks. So yeah, I'd love to see the full results if, this was actually scaled properly and was able to reach a lot more communities. So we know it's important. We can see there's growing demand and interest. The next thing is really, how can communities strengthen and activate their local capital systems? So we've been exploring that, and we've identified these sort of key functions for a well-functioning local capital system. So you can see them here, and these are generating, accessing and managing financial capital locally, buying, owning and governing local assets, pooling and investing capital locally, purposefully using local assets to benefit the community, and managing risk, regulating and redistributing capital locally so that you can provide these essential and community services and build these financial reserves that you need for emergencies and disaster and large infrastructure needs. And in a place-based capital system, each of these functions that you see here is intentionally aligned with these values there in the center that we went through before. And what's really powerful about each of these functions is that local organisations and communities like yourselves can act on all of them. So we're really excited about this framework. It's starting to give communities a really structured and systemic way to strengthen and activate their local capital system. So yeah, ultimately, I share with you that if you want to build your local capital resilience, you can break it down. You can break it down by strengthening these individual functions in your community. And whilst this kind of just, it's a nice diagram and it's a framework and there's so many frameworks and models, we are just finding this one to be so beneficial for so many of the communities that we're working with, because often when communities are told about the capital and the financial system, et cetera, it's this big amorphous thing over here. And often when we're told about the capital and financial system, people describe it as, oh, well, that's kind of, banks, and that's the stock market, and that's da-da-da-da-da. But actually, what we're talking about are some very functional activities that communities absolutely already do, and communities can absolutely have more control over. We're talking about these types of functional things. We're talking about generating money and being able to access it and own it and govern it and invest it. So this kind of gives you that nice framework now to say, yeah, I can break this down and I can see how we can actually start to build our own local capital system. So one really good way to start is by assessing how well each of those functions is operating in your place, or maybe operating in your organization or your community, or you can even do this at a household level, and that's really powerful as well. And that's what a lot of the communities we've been working with have done, and here's an example of that. And you can see with this particular example, some of those functional areas are sort of more in the well-developed range, and some of those functional areas are more developing. So, for example, in this place, there are opportunities to generate more capital locally. You can see that. And there's opportunities, for example, to pool more capital together. So instead of having small amounts, you have a bigger pool of capital together. More opportunities to invest capital locally. But we can see that they're kind of, maturing to well-developed when it comes to, say, their needs, understanding their needs and opportunities. And so this has been really useful for communities to start to identify, what are the priorities and actions when it comes to strengthening and building their local capital system in the way that they need. So to further support communities, we've been identifying and we have identified over 100 policies and practices and strategies to actually implement and activate these functions in a place-based capital way. And for every function that I've just gone through, there is a set of practices and strategies that can help you effectively implement it in your community in a more place-based capital way. And when I say that, a place-based capital way, I mean in a way that supports those values that we went through. And so here is an example for generating capital in place. And so you can see the practices that start to spin out from that. So communities and local organizations can generate more capital in place, and they can do that by earning and making it, by saving it, by growing it, by sharing and redistributing it, and really sustaining it. And what we're finding is that when you use these practices and when you generate more capital in place by and with local people and organizations, it leads to greater local control and that greater self-reliance and that resilience that you're looking for. So similarly to that, we've also identified capital sources, financial instruments and vehicles and institutions that can activate and strengthen place-based capital. And, often when we think about, financial instruments and financial vehicles and institutions, it's like, oh, like I said before, it's like, well, that's the world of the finance sector. Like, that's not for us. But actually, no, we're finding those instruments and vehicles and institutions that are for us, that are for the community. And as I mentioned before, for every function, there is this set of instruments and vehicles and institutions that can effectively implement it in that place-based capital way that I mentioned. And so here's just one example of the types of capital places and organizations and households can make and earn to help them diversify their income streams and strengthen that financial resilience. And so you can see how that kind of spins out here from, the earn and make strategies. But there's a whole range of practices for each of the others as well. And so in that example, if you're looking to build more resilient local jobs or employment pathways or, build your more resilient local economy, by focusing on what you can make and earn in your community and really activate more of these financial capital sources. So next is case studies. So we know that these practices and these strategies and these instruments that I've just been talking about are achievable. We know they're effective because we've drawn them from real life case studies. And in our search so far, which is just a small search really, we've already found over 300 real world examples of place-based capital in action, which is super exciting. A lot of them in Australia. There's even more overseas. And so I'll share a few of those with you today, and I'll do that as well to kind of help bring this to life. And so you can see practically what does that look like and how does that translate? And really excitingly, I'm not covering this case study today, but I do sometimes. Josie mentioned the Renew Cobargo initiative that's coming up for a session. We use them as a place-based capital case study because the way that they're approaching the rebuilding and the assets is absolutely in line with place-based capital. So if anyone goes to that session, you'll start to see some really great synergy with this one. Okay, so the first example I want to start with is at the household level, and it focuses on helping households increase their savings, which of course boosts their financial capital. And by building this reserve for investments or emergencies, families can really strengthen their financial security. And collectively, this increased savings also enhances the overall capital within a community, which of course then can contribute to regional development and resilience. And a really great example of this is the Smith Family Saver Plus program, which helps families save and also gives them some match funding when they save some money. This next example sort of tries to demonstrate the power of community development organisations and community lending for supporting small business. So in this one example, this wonderful woman here is Mandy Walker and her husband as well from Walker Diesel Services. They couldn't get traditional funding for their business expansion despite having a really solid business case. But not to be dismayed, Mandy looked around and considered other sources of finance that were closer to home. And she was able to secure a loan from the Wongan Hills Community Development Group. And this was an organisation set up by local people to support local development. So another example, and one to again, bring this right back to home and make you realise, this is actually, we're doing this already, is household solar, and that's at the house level. So really just by installing solar and batteries in your home, in households and families, they're starting to own their energy assets. In many cases, that means they're producing their own energy. And when there's excess, they're then generating additional income from that energy production. And a place sort of scale and community scale example is the Manila Community Renewable Energy Company. So this is where the community has become a power retailer. They are producing and selling solar and bioenergy with profits and participation benefiting the community. And we're seeing that places aren't just doing this in the energy sector. You know, they're setting up companies and managing a whole range of essential services and assets and development. And so, you know, leaning on from that, another really great example is the Yakandanda Community Development Company. So this is a locally owned enterprise that operates as a fuel retailer. They've also got other enterprises now. And in this model, 50% of the profits are there to fund other community projects when they're available. And when we think about these things like fuel, but, you know, it'll be, charging stations and the EV charging stations of the future. But we think about fuel and energy. These are things that are essential services. They make a lot of financial capital, but when they're privately owned, they're not serving the community in a capital sense. But when they're community owned, that capital is serving the community. So we've also learned that in some cases, it may not be possible or really make sense for communities to do this alone. So this example here shows how private developers can support place-based capital through private community partnerships and co-investment. And one example of this is from Fintry in Scotland. It's a wonderful example where I guess instead of rejecting a wind farm development proposal or accepting what you might hear often as benefit sharing, the community asked to have a stake in this development. So what happened here was an additional turbine was added to the project by the developer. That turbine was owned by the community of Fintry. The money for that was given as a loan by the developer, and then the profits made by that turbine paid off that loan, and now the community earn a significant revenue over time that they're investing back into the community and community development. The next example is in this really critical space now, housing development. And this one is the Wimmera Southern Mallee Development Organisation. So it's been set up to build, own, rent and sell affordable housing. And they're already well on their way of doing that. Another example is in Bellingen. So they've set up a community land trust. They're starting to work with, say, the local credit union to develop mortgage products for that. They're working with the council to identify land for that asset. So lots of really great things happening. And this kind of, really shows the role that financial institutions and councils and others can play in place-based capital. The next solution looks at income generation and how a council has sought to address challenges with rates and really play a role in owning a local asset and managing an essential service for the community. And in this case, the Shire of Dundas in Western Australia purchased the Norseman IGA in that bid to create a new revenue stream. I don't have the figure here, but from recollection, the purchase price was roughly 2-something million, in the low 2 millions. And to give you an example, within the first month, the IGA posted a profit of $250,000. So a really viable solution with that one. And then the last example I want to show you, and a bit of a different approach from another council, but this can be done by community as well, shows how place-based capital can support, future-proofing and building those capital reserves for large infrastructure and, major events and development needs. And this is the example in Muswellbrook, where they established a future fund to really play that role and make sure that they're going to be able to support future needs. So we've just explored a really small set of place-based capital examples and case studies. And I guess what I wanted to share with you was that, by themselves, these examples are often looked at as good news stories. I'm sure we all know them. We often hear the ABC loves to report, on the passionate community that banded together to save the local pub. We've all read that story, I know. And alone, when we hear these case studies, we might be inspired and we might seek to sort of replicate that case study in our own town. but often we don't usually look to them holistically as a strategic development pathway, as a resilience pathway. But as I shared, we've found over 300 examples of place-based capital, and these are examples of all sorts of things. These are policies, these are strategies, organizations, structures, vehicles, mechanisms. And they're really being applied to all sorts of problems and industries and opportunities like we just went to. And when you look at these examples from a systems perspective, what we can see is a pattern emerging across Australia. This isn't just one example. This isn't just, a good news story, as good as they are. This really is a model and a system of engaging with capital in ways that better serve the place and better serve the community. So positively for communities, there is a toolkit available to you, so you can build the local capital system you need. There are models, like I've talked about. There's these roadmaps, there's strategies, there's structures. We hope that the work of the Place-Based Capital Initiative is making this toolkit more visible and more accessible to you and your communities. And the same goes, for the work of the Resilience Canopy and what it's doing. So to kind of wrap it up and summarize for you, my sort of last thoughts I'd like to share is that, every community really needs a strong capital foundation. And if you don't have one already, place-based capital is an effective way to do it and to work towards it. Places and communities have way more power than they think to influence their local capital system. For those of you in practitioner roles, there are these solutions, there's these tools, there's these networks that can help you with implementation. If there is anyone along today from more of a, say, government or intermediary or those more strategic roles, what we're seeing is that whilst a lot of these solutions and tools exist, there really is a critical need to activate and scale them through enabling policies and targeted resources and direct support for local implementation with places. Finally, just I guess for us all collectively, I'm super excited. I'm very optimistic. I think that, by working together, across our places and in our organizations or departments, that, we really can build an inspiring and a leading capital system that's going to meet and need the sort of needs and aspirations of this era. And really support those strong and challenge-ready communities that you're working towards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Meaghan. What a call to action for everybody. This is fantastic. We have a question from Christine. Do you want to jump on, Christine? And then we'll hear it's a related comment question from Donnelly and then Stephen.
Yep, I'm here. Yeah, first of all, thanks, Meaghan. I just wrote there that this has been great because it really is something that focus on the finances is something that's going to move any community forward and become self-sustaining. And so, we were just, how do you, I'm thinking at a local level, how do you start? Like that's, if you're buying something that's like a local IGA, does that come from community shareholders or government funding or grants or, how does it, it's really interesting. It's like, I guess we're just thinking of the details for us in a smaller community. How does it work?
Yeah, such a great question, Christine. I guess I would just say in terms of like, the first thing is, is just to start. Is just to sort of recognize the community. We're not going to really get anywhere that we want to go unless we firmly take that grip hold around our local capital and start to make steps on that. And hopefully, today's kind of, sort of really demystified that absolutely can, and many are. I guess in terms of then where to start, that's, I guess, why we worked up that kind of functions framework, because where to start is a tricky question. And there might be a really live opportunity in your community. Maybe there is some asset that's up for sale. Maybe there's some, great community organization that's rallying around housing, or, you know, like every community is a little bit different, and finding that right place to start might be really clear and very present for you. And you can say, oh yeah, that's that place-based capital thing, and we're just going to roll with that. And you don't have to think about it any more deeply than that. Just be like, it's already going and we've got momentum, and let's get behind it. But if it's not clear, but you know that you need to start moving in this way, that's where that kind of assessment can be really good. You know, you can sit down with a few neighbors or your whole community, whatever it might be, and you can do that little assessment, and you can say, all right, what does capital look like in our community? You know, how are we generating money? How are we generating assets? Who owns and controls them? How are they being used? You know, and you can just start small and then build out from there. And that's going to give you a really good picture of where things are already working and maybe where you can lean into other areas. And then in terms of like what to focus on, I would just say that just depends on the people in the room and where the passion and the skills and the energy reside. And if you've got some things that you can work on, start working on them. If you identify something that you can see as critical, like maybe it is you want to kind of, there's a critical asset the community is going to lose and you need to buy it. That's where I guess you need to, but maybe you don't have the expertise. Like the community's like, well, we've never bought an asset before. Yeah, that's where it does help to rally around and say, okay, how are we going to learn from this and build? There are lots of tools and there's lots of support that's starting to emerge, but we're still, unfortunately, in this space where communities are still having to do a lot on their own and they're still having to learn. Through this network, we are starting to connect people so we can all learn from each other and you can learn from other communities. But we definitely need, you know, government, we need philanthropy, that we need them to step into this space and say, we're going to help to make this accessible and visible too. We're going to help to join the dots so that community don't have to like trial and error every time. There's just a really clear roadmap for them. Yeah. I hope that helps, Christine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think like you say, it's just one step at a time. Each community is individual, and just open your eyes and see what's out there.
Totally.
Starts with the conversation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the one step might just be just doing some learning. And you know, you've already made that one step today, and I'm sure many other steps in your community. But you're on that step, Christine, and yeah, just what's the next step? Yeah.
Fantastic. So Donnelly, Stephen, Emma, and then Trish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thanks, Meaghan. Your work's very impressive, and your great session today. I'm also speaking to a little bit to what Trisha's highlighted in her question, is we've just been out on country with Aboriginal community, and I'm really keen to, again, and something else that somebody has raised is that you have a community who don't have a understanding or capacity. They're so impoverished that they don't have the skills to be able to implement anything that is other than feeding themselves. And you see Aboriginal corporations doing their best to look after community, but you see the Roadhouse charging exorbitant fees and prices for just everyday goods. You know, tins of dog food are $10, and it's just outrageous. So there's this price gouging, and so your example of the IGA, but how do you then get a community who is incredibly impoverished, malnourished, doesn't have a financial brain, they don't speak English, the whole range of things, their health issues, like it's just exorbitant. So it's kind of that when you go into a community that's really unhealthy on all levels, and the power can't be with the white fellas, it has to be with the black fellas. Is that how can you be helpful in that? And I know it's a big question, but just it helps just even speaking it out, just sharing it with everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, and nice to see you, Donnelly. Yeah, it's a really important question. I guess I'll start by answering it and saying, you know, Aboriginal people, Australian Aboriginal, have had a really long, well-functioning, sustainable economic systems, you know, for millennia in Australia. And we need to acknowledge, you know, that they had these economic systems that were serving the land and their people really well. And there's been a big disruption to those, but there's so much that we can still learn from, Australia's First Nation people around economic and capital systems. And many of the values that we talked about, have been learnt from and do resonate with Aboriginal communities. And they have already a lot of wonderful structures and vehicles, Aboriginal corporations and ownership models, and governance models as well, that are really useful. To your point, though, Donnelly, that, in any community, there's those that can be more ready and able to lead and drive themselves, and then there's those that kind of need more support. Now, I think what we've seen for so long now in Aboriginal communities and also, disadvantaged non-Aboriginal communities is that so much of the work is about, trying to address these sort of bigger outcomes. But all of that work does it in a way that never builds a capital foundation for that community themselves. It's never building that capital asset foundation that they need for themselves. It's never building that capital capacity, that economic capacity and literacy. And so I guess where we're seeing stronger value is really starting to put energy into focusing there. And from that point, they can address their own issues in their own way. I've got a beautiful personal story, but I was really fortunate to grow up in Eastern Arnhem Land in a community called Nooka. Went to school there and, spoke language and still really connected with that community. And I was up there recently and we were talking about the energy in that community. And it's, similar. There's a lot of, poverty and, there's different levels of readiness in this particular community. And we were sitting around and we were talking through the energy cards. So for those that haven't spent time in community, a lot of them, the energy is run off diesel generators, and they have this energy card and they have to pay. And if they don't pay, their energy runs out, so they don't have energy a lot of the time. I was sitting around and I was just like, why don't you guys just set up your own solar farm? And that can be your energy. And they just immediately grabbed onto that. They were like, yeah, of course we can do that. And they've got this wonderful model up there where students can do higher education studies through Monash, no, not Monash, can't remember, it's the Sydney one, where they can do higher education on country in this bush university. So then they were like, all right, we need to convince one of our kids that's doing that bush university to go and study renewable energy. So they started to do the planning of how they would get there. They recognized that they weren't ready there yet, but they were like, oh, well, we've got that bush uni thing, and we're going to send one of our kids, tell them to go do renewable energy, and then they're going to go and do that for 3 years. And then when they come back, they're going to be the champion for us. And so, yeah, I guess it's just finding those pathways, Donnelly. But also, absolutely, that's where, philanthropy and other support really kind of comes in and helps to step through it in that way. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, we'll go to Emma because Emma and Stephen had similar questions around the policy levers, and then Trish, and then I think we might be able to squeeze you in, Melissa, so stand by.
Lovely, thank you. And hi, Meaghan, and thanks for a great presentation. It was, we've sort of come across each other through Town Team movement, and even knowing this, actually sitting in place-based capital is a more holistic system than just the financial part of things. Like big finance capital is a really important reminder for everyone. I was curious about, and I know it will vary from place to place, but the sort of levers, policy levers that you kind of want jiggled with and played with or released in local government, and aware that they might be different for, sort of entry-level kind of activity in this place-based capital area, and then what sort of levers are needed from local government when you're talking about, sort of more advanced, more ready communities who are able to take this on in a holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, Emma. So I guess, thinking about local government, the first thing really is, when they're thinking about their council plans, 5, 10 years, whatever they do, is really embedding into plans those types of values that we're talking about, really embedding into those plans that, They want to see this shift over 5-10 years in the local economy, you know, in the way capital works, that kind of thing. So helping to set that vision for the community. Councils are very good at capacity building. So, you know, if they're setting that vision in their council plan, actually having some strategies to back it up, or how will they build the capacity of the community, local business, you know, all the different players in their particular place to start to engage with this, and so they can activate it and council's not having to carry the load. Absolutely as well. And so council policy. So I mentioned, you know, in Bellingen, they're set up the Community Land Trust. They've been working very closely with council. So council has a housing policy that's been informed by the work of these community members. And that housing policy is really starting to think about what are alternative, you know, housing models that support community, that support, you know, collective ownership and structure and, you know, tiny homes, etc. So councils absolutely can set up those housing policies or any other policy that's going to really support this work. You know, councils in themselves, we call them an anchor institution. That's sort of part of community wealth building world. They, depending on their size, but they definitely have influence over, you know, where they spend their money and what they choose to do. They've got a whole range of assets themselves, how they use them. Some councils sell them off, don't sell them off, sell them to the community if you need to sell. You know, there's lots of ways that council has all of these capital controls within how it operates. So really leveraging those as well. What else? Council levers. So I guess there's, you know, you can see councils thinking a bit differently about their role, like the Norseman example that I gave, and thinking about how they might step into these spaces as well and do that particular work. And then definitely like thinking about councils and how they're working together, you know, at that regional scale as well. So I think, so Josie mentioned it briefly here. We've been looking at this networked local investment fund model. We know that a lot of communities want to set up investment funds like that Muswellbrook Future Fund I talked about. Funds are a really great way for communities to pool money together. So you've got this pool of money to put into things. And we're talking about equity funds, so you can actually make a return on it and grow your community money. But funds are really hard to set up. But actually, if you start to network and work within your region or across your state, then things can work together. And councils play a really good role at like connecting with things like that as well. So yeah, hope that's useful.
I just love the kind of big thinking rooted in place. It's just really, really inspiring. And this is sort of a related question from Trish around the collaboration potential language. Trish, if you want to jump on, and then we'll finish up with Melissa.
Cool. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it is about the big thinking, and what the wording that really jumped out at me was when you said building the economic capacity and literacy. I really liked that. But my question is, sometimes the other side of finance can be, you know, can be the language or the vibes is like extractive or negative, like, you know, it doesn't always get painted in a good light. And so how do you not get tangled up in that when we're taking a more collaborative, collective, value-based approach? And I'm not saying all finance is bad, but how do you not get tangled up in
yeah totally. I guess what we've found is, you know, focus, that's what I framed at the start. Like these days I've been tangled up in, you know, all of that over the years, many tangles and threads. So these days, yeah, it really is focusing on what you can control. You know, every community can set up a community development corporation. Every community can set up a community development financial institution. You know, there is so much that communities can set up and start to work towards. It might take a little bit of time. We've got communities that we engaged with 5 years ago, and they've now set it up. And 5 years can sometimes seem like a long time, but actually in the big scheme for a community and its longevity, you know, these places are going to be here hopefully for hundreds or more years. That's a really short time. So yeah, just really focusing on what the community can do. If your particular structure or solution is needing to actually engage in those spaces, then, you know, it's about finding those more aligned partners that are willing to engage in that way. So example, you know, like you think about that developer in the Fintree case study I showed you. There's lots of developers that will say no. That's happening right now. There are hundreds of developers out there that are going into community and saying, nah, we're not interested in kind of co-investing or co-owning with you. We'll set up a little fund and we'll kind of give you some money, and won't that be nice? you know, and it's like that's the best that we can offer. But there are developers out there that are saying, yeah, no, we'd be interested in co-investing with community and kind of like co-owning with community. We're talking to one at the moment, and, you know, hopefully actually it might frame their whole policy. You know, we'll see where that goes. I can't remember the name of it, but there is one in Australia where the Aboriginal community, where I think it's a renewable energy project, they've been invited to co-own and co-invest. So yeah, start with what community can do. Engage with those players when you need to, but find the aligned ones. And then just keep coming back to community if they're not willing to engage, and just keep building. Yeah. Yeah.
And just to follow up on that, Tim Castell made the point around timelines. That I'm sure there's something there about owning your own timelines and not being swept up into somebody else's.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, like, it's so easy for us to get caught up in everything that's going on out there in the world. Like, us kind of, there's so little we can really do to kind of shift a lot of that big meta stuff. But that's why I kind of had that systems diagram at the end. Because what we can powerfully do as communities is build the thing in our community. And if we just focus on building the thing in our community, and we're all doing that, we're going to have a powerful system of communities. And then once we all have, like, so back to your point as well, Trish, let's say, you know, I set up a community development institution here, and you know, you set it up in New Zealand, and someone else sets up here and here and here. Those institutions can start to work together. They can trade together. They can support each other. And so that's when you actually start to see scale, and you start to see a bigger shift. And that's already happening. Like, we are already seeing that happening. So you'll just be tapping into what exists and helping to scale it and make it stronger. Yeah.
So, Melissa, a quick question from you to finish off.
So I saw, obviously, with Scotland have brought out their community wealth building bill last week, and it kind of segues just from where you're talking, Meaghan. Examples of those communities that are scaling and they're almost kind of can be there that we can get to, like Scotland. Are there examples of one place that's scaling up that we could learn from?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you mean Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Melissa, right near you, Castlemaine. You know, they're a really great example. So they've introduced a wellbeing economy strategy at the council level. The community have gone through, you know, exploring place-based capital. They're setting up a community investment cooperative. They're talking to government about how that wellbeing economy approach could kind of scale to others. Yeah, I mean, it's a good example. In terms of the kind of scale that you're talking about around as well, like, you know, big national policies that support. So Melissa mentioned Scotland and the community wealth building policy. It's really exciting. So it's going to enshrine in legislation that there has to be like a place-based capital like approach. Community wealth building and place-based capital are really similar. They've also got wonderful legislation that's called community first right to buy. And what that means, if a asset's going up for sale in a community, the community have the first right to buy it. So it's like, I can't remember the technicality, but it's like you've got 6 months as a community to buy it. And if you can't, then it'll get opened up to the private market. I mean, imagine that in our community. So there's really some phenomenal as well legislation and policy that can be implemented. And, you know, just, I guess in Australia, the social enterprise policy movement is a good example. And we're starting to see that there's a lot more state and federal government can be doing in this space, and we hope that they start to. Yeah.
So we're at time, and I would just love to keep this conversation going for another hour. But I know that, Meaghan, you've probably got some other things to do. But I think the work that you and Ethical Fields are engaged in is actually really inspiring for everybody on this call, because you're embodying what the invitation is to everybody in community right now. Just start to build it out. So maybe just a final reflection about what it's like to be where you are right now compared to when you were starting, when you got that first sniff of, you know, the patterns emerging, and what's kept you going.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. That's such a good question, Josie. Yeah, I guess when I first started, I was coming, and this might be some of you actually, when I first started, I was coming from a place of grief having worked in all those places I mentioned at the start, climate change, environment protection, biodiversity, oh God, I held a lot of grief. And I had to process some of that grief, and then I just knew that the economics and the capital was where I was going to really drive my efforts. And when I first started, I guess we were looking to international places. We were looking to the UK and the US, and we were looking at their community wealth building model, and we were driving that here. And then what emerged from that is the Australian kind of adaptation, which is place-based capital. And where now, I honestly, I get 2 to 3 calls a week from folks in like Canada, and I just can't kind of keep up. So like now internationally, they're looking to us, which is really exciting. And a couple of weeks ago, Economic Development Australia, so they're the peak body for economic development professionals. And so by their nature, they sort of sit in the middle, right? They've got to be a bit mainstream. They can't be like, they held a national roadshow around these types of economic approaches. They held a national roadshow on things like place-based capital and wellbeing economies. And so that to me is almost like the beautiful signal that this type of economy, this type of capital model is sitting firmly now in the mainstream places, and ready for you to start driving it in your community, because you'll get traction, not conflict as well. So I'm super excited. It's super nice to connect with all of you. I can't wait to hear what you do in your community. And yeah, thanks again, Josie and the team. So
thank you so much. And do check out Ethical Field's website. There's a great summary of some of the steps that you can go through to learn more about this, different levels. It's just a wonderful system level piece of work that you and your peers are doing, Meaghan. So tell your friends, tell other people in your communities, and we look forward to inviting you back for an update. And hopefully it'll be some of the people on this call will be new case studies. So please join me in thanking Meaghan. And yeah, look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Meaghan.